People of African descent are some of the oldest residents of Texas. Beginning with the arrival of Estevano in 1528, African Texans have had a long heritage in the state and have worked alongside Americans of Mexican, European, and indigenous descent to make the state what it is today. The African American experience and history in Texas has also been paradoxical. On the one hand, people of African descent have worked with others to build the state's unique cultural heritage, making extraordinary contributions to its music, literature, and artistic traditions. But on the other hand, African Americans have been subjected to slavery, racial prejudice, segregation, and exclusion from the mainstream of the state's institutions. Despite these obstacles and restrictions, their contributions to the state's development and growth have been truly remarkable. From the beginning of European settlement in Texas, people of African descent were present. In 1528, Estevano, a Moor, accompanied Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca across the territory known today as Texas. Estevano was an important member of the Cabeza de Vaca expedition because he could interpret the languages of many of the Native Americans that he encountered. Along with other members of the expeditions, he was captured by Indians and enslaved for 5 years. After escaping, Estevano and the surviving members of the expedition made their way to Mexico. In 1539, he accompanied a second expedition into the southwest, seeking Cibolo, or the 7 cities of gold. This time, he was killed by the Zuni Indians, and the expedition failed. Other pioneer Africans accompanied the Spanish into the southwest, and some settled in the region known today as Texas. By 1792, Spanish Texans numbered 34 blacks and 414 mulattoes. Some of them were free men and women. Unlike Estevano and some of the Africans who inhabited Texas prior to settlement by Anglo-Americans, most African Americans entered the area as slaves. The first Anglo-Americans who settled in Texas came from the southern United States and were accustomed to using enslaved Africans as an important source of labor. During the first 15 years of Anglo-American settlement in Texas, from 1821 to the Texas Revolution in 1836, slavery grew very slowly. On the eve of the Revolution, about 5,000 African Americans were enslaved in Texas, 13% of the population. With independence from Mexico, however, Anglo-Americans made slavery an integral part of the Republic, and later the state's economic development. And the enslavement of African Americans grew rapidly. By 1840, 13,000 African Americans were enslaved in Texas. By 1850, 48,000 were enslaved, and by 1860, 169,000, or 30% of the Texas population. In this empire for slavery, according to historian Randolph Campbell, the experience of the enslaved African Americans was similar to that in other parts of the American South. The records gathered by Campbell, as well as the testimony of African Americans enslaved in Texas, attest to the fact that enslaved African Americans in Texas had a harsh and as easy a lot as those who were enslaved in other parts of the South. 2 cases illustrate this fact. In 1861, a Canadian newspaper published the story of Lavinia Bell, a black woman who had been kidnapped at an early age and sold into slavery in Texas. She escaped from bondage and told of being forced to work naked in the cotton fields near Galveston. She also told about how, after her first escape attempt, she was physically mutilated and beaten severely by her owner. Other African Americans who were enslaved in Texas told similar stories of violence and cruelty by their owners. Hundreds sought to escape, especially to Mexico. But there were also cases such as those of Joshua Houston, who was owned by a Texas patriot, Sam Houston. Joshua owned initially by Houston's second wife, became an important member of Houston's family. He was treated well, taught to read and write, and prepared well for his eventual emancipation by the Houston family. After the Civil War, Joshua became a politician in Huntsville, and as if to underscore his loyalty to his former owners, on one occasion he offered to lend money to Sam Houston's widow when she faced financial difficulties. While the treatment of African Americans enslaved in Texas may have varied on the basis of the disposition of individual slave owners, it was clear that white Texans in general accepted and defended slavery. Moreover, slavery in Texas had all of the characteristics that had made it successful in other parts of the South. For instance, slaveholders dominated the state's economic and political life. The government of the Republic of Texas, and after 1845 the state legislature, passed a series of slave codes to regulate the behavior of African Americans who were enslaved and to restrict the rights of those who were free. The census counted about 400 free African Americans in 1860, although there may have been closer to 1,000. Texas laws blocked the migration of free African Americans into the state. White Texans also restricted the civil liberties of white opponents of slavery in order to suppress dissent about the institution. When rumors of a slave insurrection circulated in the state in 1860, Texans virtually suspended civil liberties and due process. Suspected abolitionists were expelled from the state, and one was even hanged. A vigilante group in Dallas lynched 3 enslaved African Americans, Sam, Cato, and Patrick, who were suspected of starting a fire that burnt most of the downtown area. Other slaves in the county were whipped. The Texas vote for secession in February 1861 hastened the end of slavery and set in motion the eventual liberation of the state's African American population. Despite the objections of Sam Houston to joining a nation, the Confederate States of America, based on the enslavement of African Americans, white Texans voted 3-1 for secession. For African Americans in Texas, the Civil War brought freedom, but it did not come until June 19, 1865. In contrast to other parts of the South, where the approach of the Union Army encouraged thousands of enslaved African Americans to free themselves and run away, Texas African Americans remained enslaved until the end of the Civil War. Few were able to run away and enlist in the Union Army as African Americans men did in other parts of the South. Nor were they recruited to serve as soldiers in the all-white regiments that Texas sent to support the war effort of the Confederacy. Moreover, even after Union Army General Gordon Granger read General Order No. 3 in Galveston on June 10th, announcing the end of slavery in Texas, many African Americans still had to fight for their freedom from slavery for months because their so-called owners refused to accept emancipation. The Reconstruction era presented African American Texans another challenge. Many had to rebuild their lives, locate lost family members, and begin to live their lives as self-sufficient free men and women. The establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in the state aided this transition from slavery to freedom. But given the continual racial animosity that separated blacks and whites after the war, this was not an easy task. The state legislature in several Texas cities passed black codes to restrict the rights of African Americans, to prevent them from having free access to public facilities, and to force them back to the rural areas as agricultural laborers. The use of the political system and legal system to regulate African American behavior and life was accompanied by a literal reign of terror in the state. According to the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, from 1865 to 1868, white Texans committed over 1,500 acts of violence against African Americans. Whites murdered more than 370 African Americans. These acts of violence by whites represented their attempt to reestablish white supremacy and to force African Americans back into their place. In 1867, the United States Congress eliminated the black codes and sought to prevent and provide for a modicum of personal safety for African Americans in Texas by imposing military rule and by enforcing strong federal measures such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and proposing the 14th Amendment. These congressional actions to protect African American rights ushered in the second phase of the Reconstruction in the state. In this period, African Americans made a substantial contribution to the transition of Texas from a slave labor state to one that was based on free labor. 10 African American delegates at the Constitutional Convention of 1868 to 1869 helped to write a new state constitution that protected civil rights, established the state's first public education system, and extended the franchise to all men. Between 1868 and 1900, 41 African Americans served in the state legislature, and they helped to move the state towards democracy. African American Reconstruction leaders such as George T. Ruby and Norris Wright Cuney became important members of the Republican Party and, along with other African Americans, dominated state Republican politics through the end of the 19th century. During the course of the Reconstruction period, many African Americans moved from the state's rural areas to cities such as Dallas, Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. On the outskirts of these cities, they established freedmen towns, which became the distinct African American communities that still exist today. African American labor also contributed substantially to the economic development of these cities and helped the state to become the transition from its near total dependence on agriculture to industrialization. In 1879, a few thousand African American Texans moved to Kansas seeking greater opportunities. Other African American Texans participated in the post-war cattle boom. These were the black cowboys. While the presence on the frontier of African American soldiers, called Buffalo Soldiers by their Indian foes, exemplified the desire of many African Americans to act on their citizenship responsibilities by joining the military. As in other parts of the South, Reconstruction lasted only a short time in Texas. White Democrats regained control of the state in 1873 and proceeded to reverse many of the democratic reforms instituted by black and white Republicans. Between 1874 and 1900, the gains that African Americans had made in the political arena were virtually lost. In the 1890s, for example, more than 100,000 African Americans voted in Texas elections. But after the imposition of a poll tax in 1902 and the beginning of white primaries in 1903, fewer than 5,000 African Americans voted in 1906. In addition, racial segregation was established in all facets of public and private life in Texas for African Americans. In Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, public transportation and accommodations, schools, and eventually neighborhoods were segregated by law. African Americans in Houston and San Antonio challenged segregation on public transportation by forming their own bus and jitney companies. Dallas African Americans won a case in 1916 that overturned a residential segregation ordinance. But nothing succeeded in stemming the tide of segregation and violence that restricted the rights of African American Texans. By the early 20th century, one form of violence used to enforce racial exclusion was lynchings, and the victims of lynchings, which did not end until the 1940s, were predominantly African American. Brutal and vicious acts of violence against African Americans, such as burning at the stake of Jesse Washington in Waco in 1916, called the Waco Horror by the NAACP, happened too frequently to African Americans to live without some fear for their lives. Race riots, such as those in Houston in 1917 and Beaumont in 1943, destroyed African American neighborhoods. These race riots and lynchings combined with political disenfranchisement and legal segregation to make African Americans less than second-class citizens. As a result, several thousand African American citizens moved out of the state to the north and west in the early 20th century. Although the percentage of blacks in Texas fell to 20% of the population by 1900 and declined further into the 20th century, their numbers grew to more than 600,000 in 1900 and 900,000 in 1940. Despite their second-class status, African Americans built viable and progressive communities throughout the state. Almost immediately after the Civil War, they established churches, schools, and other social organizations to serve their own needs. They established newspapers, the Dallas Express, Houston Informer, and San Antonio Register, grocery stores, funeral homes, and other business establishments that served a predominant African American clientele. In the late 19th century, African American farmers formed a cooperative to encourage African American land ownership and to raise crop prices. From 1900 to 1940, a majority of African American Texans remained in farming, with about 20% owning their land while most rented farms as tenants. The Great Depression of the 1930s hastened the trend towards urbanization. In the same period, African Americans in Dallas organized a cotton processing mill, but it failed in less than 5 years. These self-help and economic development efforts by African American Texans indicate that they did not allow the opposition of white racism to deter them from striving to build successful communities. After the Civil War, African Americans also developed their first educational institutions. Black colleges such as Bishop, Paul Quinn, and Wiley were founded by several religious denominations, primarily Baptist and Methodist organizations. African American churches such as Bull Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Dallas also started the first schools in that city for black children. The city of Houston provided schools for its African American citizens beginning in 1871, and by 1888 the city government of Dallas followed suit. African Americans also contributed to the state's social and cultural heritage in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Musicians such as Blind Lemon Jefferson, Huddle Leadbelly Ledbetter, Eddie Durham, Scott Joplin, and many others became innovators in blues, jazz, and ragtime. Singers such as Julius L.C. Bledsoe and Osceola Mays sang songs from the African American folk tradition as well as their own contemporary compositions. Such writers as Maud Cuney Hare, J. Mason Brewer, and Sutton Griggs wrote biographies and novels and recorded the folklore of African American Texans. Artist John Biggers of Houston became one of the nation's most important mural painters and an internationally recognized artist in sports such as African American Texans as Charlie Taylor, Ernie Banks, Jack Johnson, and George Foreman earned national fame in football, baseball, and boxing respectively. After the integration of the state's universities, African American athletes such as Earl Campbell of the University of Texas at Austin, Elvin Hayes of the University of Houston, and Jerry Levias of Southern Methodist University had outstanding college athletic careers. One of the most significant achievements of African Americans in the state was their participation in the Texas Centennial of 1936. This event was important because African Americans highlighted the contributions they had made to the state's and the nation's development. Through the efforts of A. Maceo Smith of the Dallas Negro Chamber of Commerce and Samuel W. Houston of Huntsville, the Hall of Negro Life was built at Fair Park in Dallas to bring the state the works of Harlem Renaissance painter Aaron Douglas and Atlanta University artist Hale Woodruff, as well as to exhibit the paintings of Texas artists James Thibodeau of Dallas, Samuel County of Houston, and Frank Scheinel of Galveston. More importantly, the Negro Day event held in Dallas on October 19, 1936, as the African American celebration of the Texas Centennial proved to be an important opportunity for African American Texans to meet and plan strategy to end the segregation and discrimination that they faced. 3 organizations emerged from the Negro Day celebration in 1936. The Texas State Conference of branches of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Texas State Negro Chamber of Commerce, and the Texas Negro Peace Officers Association, now the Texas Peace Officers Association. All 3 organizations had as their objective to improve the lot of African Americans in Texas. The Texas Centennial was indeed a watershed event for African Americans. After it, they launched a campaign to win citizenship rights in the state's segregation laws, and racist tradition denied them. Texas African Americans won 2 of the nation's most significant civil rights cases through the selfless efforts of the leadership of El Paso physician Dr. Lawrence A. Nixon and Houston activist R.R. Grovey, African Americans challenged the state's white primary system 3 times from 1927 to 1935. Eventually, they won a Supreme Court decision in Smith v. Allwright in 1944, which declared the white primary unconstitutional. This landmark case won by African American Texans opened primaries for blacks throughout the South. In 1950, African American Texans also won one of the major legal cases that eliminated segregation in the South's graduate professional schools. The Sweat v. Painter case, filed by Thurgood Marshall, legal counsel of the NAACP, and local NAACP attorney William J. Durham of Dallas, forced the University of Texas Law School to admit black students. Although the Sweat case was one of the several cases that the NAACP filed to gain entry for African American students into graduate and professional schools, it also became one of the cases that laid the groundwork for the NAACP's challenge to segregation in public schools in the infamous Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas case. Despite the notion among some historians that Texas did not need a civil rights movement to end its legacy of racial discrimination, African Americans had to use both the courts and the direct action in the 1950s and 1960s to win access to public services and accommodations throughout the state. Using a variety of methods, including negotiation and political activism, African American citizens won the right to sit on juries, equal pay for equal work for African American teachers, the elimination of residential segregation in the state's major cities, jobs on the police forces of Dallas and Fort Worth, open seating on public transportation throughout the state, and access to jobs in the public and private sectors. They also used sit-ins in Houston and Marshall to end segregation in public accommodations. By the mid-1950s, only one area of citizenship rights continued to elude African American Texans, serving in elective office. To overcome their exclusion from elective office, as well as to fight the white primaries, poll taxes, and the other legal disenfranchisement efforts, African American citizens and Texans formed organizations such as the Third Ward Civic Club and the Harris County Negro Democratic Club in Houston in the 1920s and 1930s, the Progressive Voters League in Dallas in 1936, and Charles Bellinger's Negro Citizens Executive Committee in San Antonio in 1926 to mobilize the African American electorate and to influence white politicians to address their community's needs. In the 1950s and 1960s, African American Texans challenged the paternalistic arrangement and overcame their exclusion from elective office. In 1958, Houstonian Hattie Mae White became the first African American to win an elective office in the state since Reconstruction by winning a seat on a school board. But many citizens thought that she was white and voted for her in error. She served 9 turbulent years on the Houston School Board, fighting constantly to force other members of the board to implement court-ordered desegregation of the school system. After Mrs. White's election, African American Texans did not win another elective office until 1966, when several African American candidates throughout the state won political races. Among the pioneers were Joseph Lockridge of Dallas and Curtis Graves of Houston, who won seats in the Texas House of Representatives, and Barbara Jordan of Houston, who won a seat in the Texas Senate. In 1967, Emmett Comrade became the first African American elected to a local office in Dallas, a school board, and in 1971, Judson Robinson Jr. became Houston's first African American city councilman since Reconstruction. A year later, Houstonians elected Barbara Jordan to the United States House of Representatives. Thus, she was the first African American in Texas history to represent the state in Congress. Barbara Jordan's election symbolized the progress that blacks had made in the state after over 100 years of racial segregation and exclusion. Despite the lingering effects of the old racist and segregationist policies, African Americans continued to achieve in both the private and public spheres of the state. They won elective office at the city, county, and statewide levels. In 1992, for example, Morris Overstreet of Amarillo became the first African American to win a statewide office when he was elected to a judge on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. In 1995, Ron Kirk became the first African-American mayor in Dallas, and in 1998, Lee P. Brown became the first African-American to serve as the mayor of Houston. In 1985, John Wiley Price became Dallas County's first African-American county commissioner, and Elfranco Lee became the first African-American to win a seat on the Harris County Commissioner's Court. In 2007, attorney Craig Watkins became the state's first African-American district attorney when he won the election in Dallas County. 4 African-American Texans, Mickey Leland of Houston from 1979 to 1989, Craig Washington of Houston from 1989 to 1995, Shirley Jackson Lee of Houston from 1995 till today, and Eddie Bernice Johnson of Dallas from 1993 until today, have represented the state in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1979. Employment opportunities have also increased significantly for African-American Texans, especially in the larger urban areas such as Dallas and Houston. Since 1983, for instance, Dallas and Houston have ranked consistently in Black Enterprise Magazine's 10 best cities for blacks because of the social, political, and economic opportunities available for African Americans. In addition, African Americans have continued to participate in the state's social and cultural life and to add their creative talents to the state, as well as nation's artistic development. 2 of many examples are the works added to American literature of Houston playwright and author Nsoke Shange and short story writer J. California Cooper of East Texas. Shange's work, For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, played on Broadway and toured the country for several years. Her novels, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, and Betsy Brown, were nationwide bestsellers. Cooper's short stories In a Piece of Mind, 1984, and Family, 1991, also earned her national acclaim. In addition, musical icons such as Beyonce Knowles of Houston and Erykah Badu of Dallas have won Grammy and other national awards for their music in the jazz, rhythm, and blues and pop genres. These achievements were the result of African American Texans' ongoing struggle for equal opportunity and human dignity. African Americans have lived in the area known as Texas as long as any other ethnic group except for Native Americans. Throughout their history in the state, they have contributed their blood, sweat, and hard labor to make Texas what it has become in the 21st century. In 2011, over 3 million African Americans lived in Texas, but they formed only 12% of the state's population. 2/3 of African American Texans lived in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. Nearly 1 million African Americans were spread across the state from Texarkana to El Paso and Amarillo to Corpus Christi. They made up significant parts of the populations in Beaumont, Port Arthur, Austin, and San Antonio. Their contributions to the history and culture of these smaller cities were just as significant as in those of the major metropolitan areas of the state. Overall, no matter where they lived in the state, African American citizens had to work and struggle to overcome and reverse the negative aspects of the previous 450 years. Now, in the second decade of the 21st century, African Americans have made major progress towards overcoming the historical paradox that made them some of the state's most productive and creative citizens, but also some of its most oppressed.